Terrific. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Hello. Welcome to our sixth Let's Talk Ghost Gear webinar, this time focused on methods to locate lost and abandoned fishing gear in aquatic environments. For those who don't know me, I think everyone does, but for those who don't, my name is Joel Baziuk, the Associate Director for the GGGI. I'll be moderating the webinar today. Thank you all for taking the time out of your day, your evening, your night in some cases, to be here today. I really do appreciate it. And as we've mentioned on previous episodes, there's two real key purposes to these webinars. So first, we want to give our members a chance to showcase their work to other members and to a larger audience via our YouTube channel. And second, we want to give everyone a chance to connect directly with one another, hopefully spark some interesting conversations, which will hopefully follow on after this webinar around future collaborations around lost and abandoned fishing gear. So we'll have three speakers today, each of whom will have about 10 minutes to present on their work, and then we'll have an open panel discussion. We encourage people to actively ask questions. We'll take questions from those who raise their hands using the raise hand function at the bottom of the Zoom window under the reactions tab. We'll also be monitoring the chat, so if you are more comfortable doing that, that's fine. If you're able to, we'd love to hear your voices and see your faces, but I do realize that some people will be at different times of the day and in different environments, so that's totally fine if you're not able to. So our panelists today, very quickly, will be Joan Drinkwin, Vice President of Natural Resources Consultants, Dr. Sol Milne, the Director of Wolffish Limited, assuming that we can get him on the line, because I don't see him here yet. We are reaching out to try to make that happen. And Colin Toole, the Operations Manager for CSR Geosurveys Limited. So we have our webinar scheduled for 60 minutes today, and we'll see how far we go. We can go a little bit over as long as folks are willing and able to do that. But I think that's enough for me. So without further ado, I will pass it on to Joan. Joan, if you'd like to share your screen, then we can get started.
Thank you, Joel. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Excellent. So as Joel mentioned, I'm Joan Drinkwin, and I'm a partner at Natural Resources Consultants. We're a small fisheries consulting firm in Seattle. We do extensive work with industry, especially in the Bering Sea, and extensive work on abandoned, lost, and discarded fishing gear. And in this presentation, I'm just going to call it lost fishing gear because it's a lot easier to say, recognizing that sometimes gear is abandoned, sometimes it's discarded. Our firm wrote the first comprehensive assessment of lost fishing gear in U.S. fisheries in 1990, and recently completed a report to Congress with reporting the status of lost fishing gear in U.S. fisheries, which is currently working its way through the review process, as all reports to Congress do. We are also a charter member of the Global Ghost Gear Initiative. So I'm going to talk today about a variety of methods to find lost fishing gear in marine waters. I'm not going to get super deep into all the protocols, but I'm happy to answer any questions during the panel discussion and also afterwards. The first question related to locating lost fishing gear is, why are you locating it? What's your ultimate goal? Your objectives will inform the methods you use and how precise your location data has to be. If you're looking to eventually remove the gear from the water, then your location data has to be precise. However, it's valuable in many instances to locate lost fishing gear for other reasons. Maybe you want to understand the scale of the problem or the locations of high loss in order to determine why it's being lost and to take actions to prevent future loss. These are all valid reasons and will inform the methods you use to look for lost fishing gear. How do you do that? How do you find this in this? Or more appropriately, how do you find this in this? So there are lots of ways to find lost fishing gear, and most of them are covered in these two guidance documents that can be found on the Global Ghost Gear Initiative's website. They are high-level reviews of various methods and don't go into too much specific detail. One of our panelists here from CSR Geosurveyors is featured in the document on the right as a case study. The very first thing to do before you decide exactly how you're going to find gear in the water is to focus your efforts. You do this by gathering local ecological knowledge. You can do this through interviewing fishers, having reporting systems, and even crowdsourcing data. Fishery data is an important place to start. You have to know where people are fishing and where they lose gear. If you don't have a lot of information, predictive models, which can identify the characteristics of locations where fishing gear is likely to be lost, can be a useful tool to narrow your focus. Once you've narrowed your focus, in-water location methods can range from simple to very technical. Other presenters today are going to discuss side scan sonar techniques and aerial surveying, so I'm going to focus on different ways to survey visually. Aerial visual surveys, surface and underwater visual surveys. Whatever your location method you choose, your surveying should always be well-planned, systematic, and include rigorous data collection. It's very important to collect null data. In other words, keep track of where you've looked but have not found gear. This is just as important than the locations of where you've found the gear, especially if you're documenting the extent of the problem and trying to understand causes of lost gear. Make sure you have a good data collection storage system in place, one that's easy to use and from which you can access data. Sometimes using your vessel's navigation software is appropriate. There are also a number of good smartphone apps that allow you to create track lines and set marks where you find gear. So now I'll give some examples of visual surveying. Visual surveys from airplanes flying at low altitude have successfully located derelict shellfish pots where buoys remain on the surface of the water. This method's been used successfully off the west coast of Washington and Oregon to locate lost Dungeness crab pots. So the Quinault Indian Nation on the west coast of Washington has also used this technique to quantify the amount and spatial extent of derelict crab pots in the project area and to document locations of high derelict pot concentration areas. Aerial surveys were conducted from fixed-wing aircraft piloted by a for-hire pilot with experience as a spotter in Alaska fisheries. During surveys, the aircraft maintained a constant elevation and speed and made multiple passes along the length of the survey area. Helicopter surveys of lost gillnets in the Fraser River in British Columbia have also been successful. Boat-based visual surveys are also a very common method to find gear, especially shellfish pot gear that still has surface buoys attached. In the British Columbia Area A Dungeness crab fishery, crab pot removals are conducted annually by chartered fishermen. They use visual surveys to locate surface buoys and immediately retrieve the pots using the vessel's crab puller. Locations of lost or encountered lost pots are kept up by captains throughout the fishing season and shared with the vessel that's chartered by the Fishermen's Association each year. Marks are uploaded in the vessel's navigation software, and locations with high density are targeted by the vessels. Lookouts in the steerage use binoculars with good ability to detect the dark crab pots on the ocean surface. The Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife in the US has also uses visual boat-based surveys to find and remove buoyed pots during closed fishing days and enforcement sweeps. And in Texas and other southern states in the US, boat-based surveys are used to remove derelict crab pots from shallow, high visibility waters. Initial identification of likely high density areas of gear is essential to ensure that these visual boat-based surveys are cost effective because they use a lot of fuel. Underwater visual surveys are another common method to find lost fishing gear. We've used these techniques extensively in the Salish Sea and elsewhere. As stated before, it's critical to have a good documented protocol for these kinds of surveys to ensure that your area of interest is covered methodically. For example, when working with an NGO in Vanuatu in the South Pacific, we developed written protocols on both dive, snorkel, and beach surveys to ground truth or predictive model we developed and prepare for removals. There, to ground truth the predictive model and to locate lost fishing gear for removal, we developed a systematic protocol to fit the reef location selected. It involved divers transecting the reef at different depths and noting the dive time when gear was found. We also developed different protocols for an estuary environment in Vanuatu. This way, we were able to determine the location of the gear from track lines being taken on board the support vessel. In the Salish Sea, we use diver surveys in areas where side-scan sonar is less reliable, such as high-relief rocky areas in the San Juan Archipelago. Surveys are tracked on board the vessel using GPS tracks, app, and the vessel's navigation software. Verbal communication with the divers using surface-supplied air ensures we know the boat's position when the net is located. Divers note the location, and then the boat pulls up right above the diver, making sure his line is taut, so we know we're right over the net, and then we mark the spot in the navigation software. Divers also note the depth and habitat and size and type of the net. In the Salish Sea, our goal was to remove 90% of the estimated 6,000 gill nets lost over time. We used multiple methods to locate the gear we removed. In this case, we combined fisher surveys with a reporting hotline, predictive modeling, side scan sonar, and diver surveys, eventually finding and retrieving over 5,800 derelict gill nets over 10 years. So my key take-home message today would be that sometimes you're going to use multiple methods to locate gear, and always keep good records of where you look, even if you don't find anything. Thank you.
Thanks, Joan. Really appreciate that presentation and the emphasis on, as we've said many times before, there's no one-size-fits-all solution to this, and there's lots of different tools in the toolbox that can be used in combination with one another to get a clearer picture. And I'm sure we'll go into a little bit more detail there in the discussion. If anyone has any questions for Joan, let's, for the sake of keeping things flowing, let's maybe write them down in the chat, or write them down and we can ask them after the fact. But Laura, if we're able to queue up Colin's presentation, that would be great.
Yep, already done.
Thank you. Then Colin, I will hand it over to you.
All right. Yeah, my name is Colin Toole. I'm with CSR Geosurveys. We're a geophysical survey company located in Nova Scotia, Canada. We specialize in marine geophysical surveys, and we've kind of used our expertise in that field to branch into ghost gear work. We've received substantial funding through the Ghost Gear Fund, through DFO, federal government in Canada. We are members of the GGGI the last few years. We've attended a couple workshops with Joel and met lots of good folks, and you know, happy to be here to, I guess, share some of our experience and some of our knowledge, and some of the things that we've learned that work well when you know, trying to track down this stuff in marine environments. So next slide. Just to give you a little overview of some of the work we've done recently. Since, I guess, 2019, we've done a substantial amount of ghost gear survey, retrieval, and disposal work. There on the right, you'll see just a pin list of some of our ghost gear projects. We focus a lot on lobster gear in the maritime regions of Canada, and also in the East Coast of the US. We've spent countless days on the water tracking down lobster gear. Crab gear we have targeted in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, which I think a lot of you probably are aware that's a big issue in that area due to the interactions with the right whales and other marine mammals. Gill nets, we've also completed a couple projects focused solely on gill nets. So we can go into ghost gear project development, management, and execution. That's, you know, essentially we do kind of everything. We focus on putting together proposals, targeting specific areas, and, you know, then we go out and we execute the work. A lot of times we partner with fishers. We find that is extremely helpful to partner with the fishers that are knowledgeable and active in the areas that we work. We use fishers a lot of times for vessel charters. Obviously their fishing expertise, because, you know, we are good at finding the gear, and a lot of times they're excellent at retrieving the gear. So we combine our skill sets to you know, kind of tackle the problem. And their local knowledge is invaluable, as I'm sure you know, that, you know, they truly are the ones that really have a good gauge on where this gear is. So we try and tap into that. As I mentioned, we target lobster traps, crab pots, gill nets, seine nets, rope. I mean, there's rope everywhere we go. In all fisheries, they seem to lose a pile of rope. Project phases that we typically go through, research, modeling, and planning. That's kind of phase one, and a lot of times we do that. That's almost what we do before we even pick a spot to go work. So we do a lot of research. We've done some modeling, and a lot of planning goes into a project before we actually hit the water. The next phase are the ghost gear surveys, where we typically use things like geophysical tools, side scan sonar primarily, but we also have multi-beam, ROV. And then the other phases of our projects are the retrievals and recycling and disposal. But I mean, this presentation focuses on kind of the first two in that list. So next slide. Ghost gear research and modeling. There's a lot of data sets out there that you can start with before you commit to a spot. So what we typically do, we're quite familiar with our local area, and we have a good idea of the areas that are have a high loss of gear. But even then, we look at the factors for each of those areas and try and determine, why is the gear lost? Where is it lost? And that all translates into how are we going to go find it and try and retrieve it. So there's data sets like vessel traffic, as you see up there in the top right. This data is available through different means, but that's essentially a track plot of all the vessel traffic, marine vessel traffic in 2022. So that'll give you some indication on where you could expect lost gear due to things like ferry tracks, aquaculture activity, cruise ships, things like that. They all result in significant amount of lost fishing gear. So that's one thing that we've used to target locations. I mean, for example, we've targeted the ferry track between the Magdalen Islands and Prince Edward Island in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. We knew that was a cause for a lot of lost gear, so we focused on that track, and sure enough, we found a lot of gear along that line. Similar to Bay of Fundy, ferry to Grand Manan, same thing. Some of the other factors that we consider too, seabed geology and topography, that's a big one. A lot of times it's the seabed that's getting a lot of this gear caught down. So you can draw on things like geological maps and CHS charts, things like that. The bathymetry is a big one. You really do want to know how deep the water is that you're going to be working in, because typically the deeper it is, the more challenging it is. Tides and currents, we have a look at those. Obviously in the Bay of Fundy, the tides are extreme, the currents are extreme, and it's a reason that there is a lot of gear loss. The weather is another biggie. So if we know there's an area that's always getting pounded by storms and severe weather, then we know there'll be gear in those areas, like Southwest Nova. You can see it on the shorelines, right? A lot of this gear gets washed up on the shorelines, but that's an indication that there's a lot of it offshore as well. Fishing practices, gear type and condition, wildlife entanglements. Obviously, that's why we've spent a lot of time in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, because it's well known that there is obviously issues with whale entanglements. Conflicts, as sad as that is, but it's a huge reason for gear loss. And we know where these conflicts happen a lot of times, and we will target those areas because conflicts generally do result in gear loss. So we've had a couple projects focus solely on just the fact that there's some significant conflicts on the water, and sure enough, we find a pile of gear left behind. And inappropriate disposal. I mean, believe it or not, there's groups out there that just don't bring their gear in sometimes. So if we catch wind of that, then obviously we'll target those areas too. Next slide. So when we put all this information together, kind of in a phase one planning phase, there's other sources, through DFO lost gear data. So DFO has a list that all you have to do is ask for it, and it's a long list of reported gear loss from fishers directly. That's the image on the bottom right. That's just kind of an image showing where for one, in the Gulf, all the lost crab pots, and you can see the hot spots, right? So those darker red patches are where there's a higher frequency of reported loss. So, I mean, they're obvious areas to target. And DFO has also made it mandatory in the last few years that fishers have to report their loss. So the database is growing exponentially the last few years, which is nice. Local fishers knowledge, which I've already mentioned, that's huge. Information from conservation protection. So in our part of the world, we have CMP, we call them. They're kind of the the field officers for DFO, and they're obviously tuned into what's going on in their local areas, and they almost always have good information on where to look and knowledge of lost gear that they'll pass on to us that we can use and focus on trying to locate it. This is a little secret that we've stumbled across that has been huge for us, but the fishers themselves, they have these navigation systems on board, particularly in the lobster fishery in the Maritimes. They use things like OLX and Time Zero. These are navigation packages they have on their boat, but all the data that is acquired from those packages is kind of dumped into a database that can be accessed, and it'll show you where there's high frequency of fishing occurring, and if there's a high frequency of fishing occurring in a particular spot, then the odds are high that you're going to find a high frequency of lost gear. So that's not all fisheries have that. I mean, we're fortunate in the Maritimes that the lobster fishery uses this stuff a lot. I mean, most boats have it, so we're fortunate that we can kind of tune into it and use it to our advantage. Next slide. So once we get the plan in place, essentially we've kind of nailed down a few spots that we want to look. We've got a project on the go in a certain location. That's when we start to kind of bring out our expertise, which is really technology-based geophysical surveys. And as mentioned, we use side scan sonar primarily, a majority of the time. Well, on all jobs, we use side scan sonar, but we've also used multi-beam sonar to locate lost gear. We've used remotely operated vehicles. You can see that little yellow machine in the bottom right there. We've used visual surveys that Joan mentioned. These are especially in the Gulf, we have a lot of success with visual surveys because it's sadly, there's a lot of crab pots usually left out after the season is closed. And I mean, they're easy pickings for us, and they're also a huge hazard to the marine mammals, because I mean, they're essentially still fishing with rope in the water and buoys on the surface. So I mean, we will, on nice days, we pick nice days, especially because you can see a long way on the water. When it's flatter out, you can pick these buoys off from quite a distance with binoculars. And I mean, I think in the Gulf last year, we had over 70 or 75 pots that we essentially just drove around and picked up, just using binoculars. So that's a good way to start, and also a good way to kind of recon your area, get familiar with the area that you plan to work. Divers, we have used divers in the past, not all that common for us, but certainly a method that is successful for finding gear. Methodology, selection of target areas. So like I said, based on phase one, we know where our target areas are. What we do, we essentially we treat it like a geophysical survey. We create survey track lines, and we just start covering the bottom with acoustic data, side scan data, and in real time we have our techs on the boat are reviewing this information coming in real time and target picking what we believe to be ghost gear on the bottom. It could be traps, could be pots, could be ropes, could be nets. I've got some examples of what we see on the boat on the next few slides that we can look at. Joel's seen some of these images, and some other folks have, but this is what gives us our success on the boat. I mean, this is side scan data showing lost lobster gear on the bottom. And I mean, these are good examples. It doesn't always look this easy or this clear cut, but I mean, this is what a pile of lobster gear looks like when it's lost on the bottom. The geology helps a lot for us. That's one of the things we do in the first phase is we try and identify areas that we know we're going to have success with the side scan, which You know, typically a muddy or a sandy bottom is ideal for us because, as you can see, these traps stand out really well in this type of bottom. As Joan mentioned, the areas where it's really rocky or outcrops, it's more difficult to see lobster gear on a side scan sonar in those types of areas. So we do tend to try and target areas we know we're going to have success where the geophysical data is going to be okay. Joel, I got that. Yeah, so this is this is one image. This is the starboard and port channel of a side scan sonar, and I mean I counted this before I came on, and I think there's over 25 lobster traps in this one image. I mean, this is maybe 2 minutes of data collection, in a particular area. So I mean, there's areas out there that it's just there's gear everywhere. I mean, that's a trawl on the right-hand side. As you can see, all those lobster traps are probably attached by a rope, right? And you can see the rope on the bottom of that rectangle, that thin line. Well, that's the main line that's connecting each one of those traps. So what we do is, we identify something like that. We really get excited when we find trawls because they're easy to retrieve too. We would drag a grapnel across that, perpendicular to that trawl and try and hook that main line. And sure enough, right, majority of those traps are going to be coming up. So yeah, that's what we're doing 90% of the time on the boat is reviewing this type of data in real time and targeting these type of targets. We have a high success rate. We've looked at enough that we've got a pretty good idea what a lobster trap is when we come across it. And like I said, it's not always that easy. A lot of times rocks look like traps, and the more time you spend, the better you get at identifying it. We also have done some recent work with DFO to essentially try and integrate AI into this process where we can use AI to our advantage it will help us pick lost gear in side scan sonar data. So that's kind of something that we're working on with DFO, and we're hopeful in the next year or two we may get to actually do a test run on the water in real time and see how effective it is. But next slide. These are crab pots, so very similar looking data, but totally different fishery. All these data examples are coming from CFA 12, Gulf of St. Lawrence. So this is the stuff that we're targeting to, remove from the water and try and reduce the risk of lost gear to right whales in particular. But any marine mammal, I mean, this stuff will catch any of those things, right? So you can see on the left, that's actually a trawl of crab pots, which you can see the rope that connects each one of those pots. There's 4 pots on the bottom, and there's that, that line in between them is the rope that is connecting them. So I mean, we would have come across that with the grapnel perpendicular to that, and most likely brought them all up. The images on the right, they're just zoomed in close-up images of what a crab pot looks like on the bottom. And I mean, this water is relatively deep. These crab fisheries target deep water. That's where the crabs live, I guess you could say. And the nice thing for us is that most of the crabbing environment is in muddy, deep holes. So it's perfect for geophysical surveys where you have a very consistent bottom type, and then you just have these crab pots sitting on top, right? So it's not all that difficult to pick pots out from this type of superficial geology. You can see there's one image there, the second one up from the bottom, where you can actually see the rope in the water column, right? So that's an indication there's rope floating up off the bottom, and that's a distinct signature that we look for to identify ghost gear. So next slide. Couple more examples of ghost gear that we find with side scan. This is the one on the left is a seine net, believe it or not. Cole, who's on the call here, he found this in the Bay of Fundy in what we call LFA 36, I think. And one thing I've said in some of our workshops is it's not always going to look like what you think it's going to look like in side scan data. What you really have to be looking for is something that just looks unusual. You know, if it doesn't look like just the bottom, if it looks like some sort of anomaly, then that really should pique your interest and have you focus in. Because this squiggle on the left, I mean, when we brought that thing up, it was a huge seine net. You know, what we're seeing there is probably the main line, you know, the biggest rope that you could imagine that is holding that seine net together. Like the netting a lot of times is difficult or almost impossible to see, but the indications of, you know, the rope gives you an indication that there's something there. And I mean, we would not have thought that was a seine net until we hooked onto it and brought it up. So those are the things you gotta just keep an eye out for if you find yourself looking at side scan data and you're, you know, if it looks like, you know, that's odd, then it's probably something, right? The one on the right, that's a gill net, which I mean just looks like a rope, but I mean Rachel was there. Rachel's also on the line here. I mean, that thing, it took, I think, 2 or 3 hours to get in the boat, and it was a huge gill net full of live crabs and fish and all that other stuff, right? So they slowly brought this thing in through the trap hauler, you know, and just picking out all the live animals and putting them back in the water. So just an example of, you know, a couple other things that we find out there that, you know, using side scan acoustic technology that you know, helps us, you know, find these things and get them out of the water. So next. Rope is everywhere. I mean, and like I said, this could be lobster, could be crab, could be gill nets, could be seine nets. They all have rope, and the rope, a lot of times it's very distinct signatures. You can see these two examples. That's rope floating up from the bottom, you know, in the water column. And the side scan, although it's just a thin, tiny line, it's, for us, when we see that, we know it's that's ghost gear, right? It's the only thing that looks like that in side scan data. So you know, and it's also, I mean, this is one of the big killers too, because that's, you know, that's elevated off the bottom. It's not laying there. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that does catch marine mammals, right? So you know, and it happens a lot. I mean, everyday we're out there, we're probably coming across 1 or 2 examples of this, you know, when we get into areas of ghost gear. So next slide. We threw an example here of multi-beam just to show that it does work. I mean, it is a valid tool for locating ghost gear. Certain types of gear it works much better for. This example is from a salmon pen. So I mean, that's a large, you know, several meter diameter salmon pen on the bottom. That you can just tell by the signature. It's, you know, such a round signature on the bottom. I mean, it's, you know, it's obvious there's something there, right? So like I said, we've used multi-beam on several jobs, and we've had success with it. And the one thing with multi-beam though, that you know, the distinction, I guess one of the distinctions are the multi-beam is attached to the boat. So the sensor is at the water surface, right? And, you know, so in shallow water, it looks great because you know, you're close to your target. When the water starts to get deeper is when the side scan really excels, because we can put that on a winch on a towfish, and we can drop it down a lot closer to the bottom, right? Which gives us a higher resolution image of what we're looking at. So next, another example of multi-beam data, and it kind of goes to show that it is more difficult, in my opinion, to identify ghost gear, but not impossible. So those are lobster traps on the left. You know, it's difficult to tell the difference between rock and lobster trap, in my opinion, in the multi-beam data, but it is useful. Like I said, if the water is shallow enough, the lobster gear is easier to pick in the data sets. You know, and some jobs we go with both tools, right? Because, you know, you just never know. Sometimes one tool works better than the other. It's nice to have options when you're on the water and you're trying to find the stuff. So that's an example of multi-beam data, just kind of streaming in real time. That's what we would be looking at on the boat. So next. ROV, this is the fun stuff. Cole loves this stuff. So we've got a little ROV that we use for, sometimes when we map targets with the geophysical data, we're not sure, like, is that a rock or is that a trap? You know, the only real way to confirm is visually. And that's what we use the ROV. So we'll throw that thing over the side. We'll, you know, everything we do survey wise is really very accurately positioned. So we can take a target and we can send this thing out into the water and, you know, essentially track down the target that we mapped. And, you know, we say, oh, look, it's a trap or it's a rock or whatnot. We also use the ROV to do some gear recoveries in shallow water. It can be used in deep water too, but where we've worked, you know, it's relatively shallow, 20 meters or less. And what we do, we send it down with that little hook on the front, and we just essentially drive right up to the trap, hook into it, and then just pull it up with the trap hauler. So the ROV is a valuable tool for sure. Okay, next. Another example of ROV data. This is probably in St. Peter's Bay, Nova Scotia. So there's a trawl, right, of lost lobster traps. You can see the rope that's connecting them. There's two in that image, but you know, this is an area we use the ROV quite effectively to do retrievals, not just identify what we'd mapped in the geophysical data, but would actually go down there and recover it using the ROV. So next. Example of this is sonar data from our ROV. So when we're down there and we're navigating the ROV along the bottom, we're looking for what we believe to be a trap. We've got a sonar on it, which is forward looking out in front of the machine. And, you know, when you see a signature like this, a perfect rectangle, you know, right, you've found a trap. So this is kind of what we use to confirm our target is a trap, or I mean, it may be a rock or whatnot. And we also use the sonar to navigate directly to the target, right? So Cole can navigate using this sonar to go right to the target. A lot of times the visibility is not great underwater, so the sonar comes in very handy. It's almost like your eyes when the water clarity is poor. Next. So the future of ghost gear detection. So there's a list of things here that I think we'll probably see more and more in the future. But they're things that would, you know, be a huge benefit for us or other groups that are looking for gear that has been lost. So acoustic beacons, and I know there's groups out there that are developing this technology that you know, I think we're going to see more and more in the real world once we get out there. But so there's passive sonar reflectors installed on fishing gear. So we've brought this up in a couple of our workshops with DFO, that for us, you know, specifically, you know, a group that's out there using side scan sonar, using multi-beam to look for this gear. You know, if they implemented you know, a regulation that said the gear needed to have passive sonar reflectors installed on it, like especially things like gill nets and seine nets, you know, it would take a lot of the guesswork out of our job when we go over a passive sonar reflector and we get that signature in our data set. We know right away that that's a gill net. Satellite buoys, this is a big one too, that I think I know there is groups that are using this a bit, but in my opinion, really it should be, you know, more widespread. But satellite buoys with GPS, right? So at the end of the a fishing season, you know, the season's closed. Well, there's still, you know, if you have a GPS on these buoys, it's going to send a signal back and tell either the CMP or DFO or groups like us, like, hey, there's still 20 buoys out there, and here are the locations, right? And it's all integrated with GPS. So especially in a place like the Gulf where we're really trying to, you know, save the right whales, it would be a huge advantage to know where and how many of these pots are still out there. Drone aerial surveys, which I think Saul may discuss. We don't do a whole lot of that, but I know it's used. And, you know, it's simple. You just, you know, you fly a drone, do an aerial survey, and you look for buoys on the water surface and identify them and then send somebody out to pick them up. And I guess there's other technology too, reserve buoys on fishing gear that release if in the water for extended periods. So, you know, essentially a backup buoy if your gear gets hung up or tangled on the bottom, you know, and your primary, you know, method of retrieving it is gone, that, you know, that buoy is no longer available. There's a backup buoy that will pop up give you a second chance to try and recover that gear. So these are some of the things I think we'll see more and more, as time goes on. I know there's a lot of groups working on technology to improve how things are done, I guess. And, I think it will certainly help the problem in the long run. So I think that's the last slide that we have. Yep.
Thanks, Colin. Very thorough, very comprehensive.
Probably
Joan,
over
I
10
know
minutes.
yeah, a little, but Joan, I know you could have gone into that level of detail as well, and perhaps we will have you go into that level of detail on a future webinar as well. But wanted to jump into the questions here, as we do have a couple that we'd like to ask. And the first one that I see is from Pine, and it's for you, Joan, is how do you distinguish between derelict crab pots and active ones during your aerial and boat-based surveys? Which I think is a really good question.
Yeah, thanks a lot. A key thing when you're looking for lost fishing gear is to really understand the fisheries in the area where you're looking. And so we generally look for these lost fishing gear during closed seasons. So any gear that's on the water during the closed season is either lost or poaching. So that's generally how we do it. If you're working in a fishery that doesn't have closed seasons, then it's going to be a little more complicated. And you always have to coordinate with the Fisheries Management Authority when you're doing this kind of work.
Thanks, Joan. And I'll just chime in very quickly that unfortunately, Dr. Milne wasn't able to make the call today. But one of the things that I think he would have spoken about is using the UAV surveys, the aerial vehicle surveys. If you use different wavelengths of light as opposed to just RGB, so normal light that we can see, if you use things like infrared or you use ultraviolet, you can actually estimate in near shore coastal environments in depth of very shallow, like up to 12 meters, you can actually estimate the amount of algal growth that is on that gear, which also gives you a clearer indication as to how long it's been down there. And again, depending on the circumstances, depending on the environment you're working in, you can estimate it that way as well. And I have another question in the chat from Luis. And this, again, directed to you, Joan, so maybe I'll let you answer it first. But Colin, I think you could probably give an answer to it as well. It's how did you dispose of the gear that you guys have retrieved?
Well, we have several streams. First of all, we try and recycle everything if possible. So, most of the time, crab pots, lobster gear is made out of wire or metal. So, if it's declared to be unusable gear, like there's a lot of rules that we deal with the Ghost Gear Fund. If it's usable, it's basically given back to DFO, and DFO notifies the owner, and they have an opportunity to get their gear back. If it's deemed to be unusable or garbage type gear where it's not going to be able to be fished again, then we recycle it. So the metal would all be transported to a metal recycler. The rope, we've got a couple streams to recycle rope. Buoys, plastic, things like that, that all gets recycled. There's very little actually. We've gotten better as our projects have kind of advanced, but our most recent jobs in the last couple of years, almost everything that we bring up is either given back to the owner or recycled one way or the other. We don't want to put anything in the landfill is kind of the goal.
Joan?
Yeah, thanks. So we've disposed of the gear that we remove in a lot of different ways. We've removed over 5,800 derelict gill nets in the Salish Sea, and there wasn't a way to recycle most of those nets when we pulled it out of the water. It's really messy. It's got a lot of biofouling on it. So a lot of that did end up in the landfill. Of course, we have in the US pretty well managed landfills, so it wasn't as bad a thing to do that. Of course, if you're working in other places, in less developed countries where their landfills are not well managed, you need to take more care, obviously, to understand, a better way to dispose of gear. But in the US, the gear that we removed, a lot of it went in the landfill. With gill nets, we did remove the lead line, and so we were able to recycle the lead line. With crab pots, generally those are recycled. They're made of metal, And so we can either put them in the metal recycling, or we'll leave them, honestly, sometimes if they don't have the owner's identification on them, we would just leave them out on the dock, and overnight they'd be gone. So if they were usable, people would take them, which was fine. And then if they did have their tags on them, we would return them to the owner. So there's a variety of different ways of disposing of any kind of lead line, though, we would be able to recycle those. And we did work with a recycler in British Columbia for a while with gill nets. And they were incinerating it. It was sort of a waste to energy sort of thing. But it hasn't always been really practical to do that, especially with the transport costs, for example, can be quite high when you're transporting removed gear all over the place just so you can recycle it.
Thanks, Joan. And I also want to shoot this one back at you first, and then maybe Colin, you can chime in as well. But Joan, I know you've done a lot of side scan work in Puget Sound and other areas around the world too. But has there been, and this one comes from William, is there a negative impact of the sonar technology on habitat and species? Because we're talking about pingers, and I've heard a similar question in things like passive acoustic pingers for releases of traps and things like that. But in your experience, has there been any data or research done on that?
No, well, I mean, not that there hasn't been any data and research, but no, in terms of the impacts to mammals and species of the side scan sonar that we're using at the frequency that we're using at. We've never detected or had any concern from our wildlife and fisheries managers about impacts to species using that technology.
Okay, thanks, Joan. Colin, I imagine it's the same for you, but yeah, do you have anything more to add to that?
Yeah, well, no, I mean, the side scan sonars that we'd use and Joan would use, I mean, they're relatively quite low power. And, you know, they're sometimes, you know, they get lumped into the same sphere as offshore seismic work, which is a whole nother level of, I mean, that obviously has a great impact on marine mammals. And, you know, these are much smaller devices, and, you know, the frequency and power levels that we're using, and we've never had, or you know, any bad outcomes, I guess, or any noticeable effect. But I should mention that we do, I mean, you know this, Joel, but we put out the hydrophones, you know, so we do a lot of retrieval work along with our side scan sonar. And, you know, the retrieval work especially is a little bit more invasive. I mean, we use a grapnel a lot of times, you know, to drag gear up off the bottom. And, you know, for places like the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the Bay of Fundy, where, you know, we expect to encounter marine mammals, we deploy a hydrophone typically every morning for 10-15 minutes, and we actually shut the boat off and we just sit there and we listen. And, you know, if we detect you know, a marine mammal signature, then we basically just pick up and we move off to another location. So we use that to try and avoid any interaction with marine mammals.
Okay, no, that's great. Thanks. Another question. We know there's no, I guess, as we mentioned earlier, there's no silver bullet solution to this. It applies to methods to locate ALDFG as well, because you're not going to be able to just find it using the same methods in all different types of environments. So there are some of these different methodologies. And how valuable is it, in your opinion, to have these different tools in the toolbox, and seeing more technologies, whether it's UAVs or whether it's ROVs, sort of adding to this toolkit, and sort of helping to frame that? Joan and Colin, you're both experts in ALDFG location and removal techniques from your own local areas, being the Pacific Northwest and the Maritimes. You've carried out similar work in different regions around the world, though. And so how have you had to adapt your typical methodologies to maybe include some of these other things? Or if that's the case?
Well, I'll just say that, you know, the work that we've done doing some ground truthing and removals in other areas like in the South Pacific and in the Caribbean, generally, it doesn't really matter. Well, there's two things. First, you have to know the environment, and then you have to know the tools that you have. So in some of these areas, they just didn't have side scan sonar. It might have been the best tool to use, but it just wasn't available. So in those situations, then you have to go to something maybe less techy or whatever they have to be able to find the gear. In Vanuatu, that was certainly the case. We probably could have found some of the gear that we found especially in some of the lagoons and in some of the outer areas with side scan sonar, but it wasn't available. So we used divers and snorkel surveys in those areas. And you just have to adjust your protocol to the environment that you're in. And in some areas, honestly, one of the things that we do in the Salish Sea is we do use side scan sonar extensively, but we often don't use it in the deep water, not because it wouldn't work, but because we're not going to remove gear from the deep water because we don't have the technology to do that in a cost-effective way. So that's another thing to remember when you're documenting your gear and where you're locating gear is to recognize that just because you're not finding gear doesn't mean it's not there. You could basically just not be looking in all the places, because if our goal is to remove the gear, we're not going to look in places that we don't have removal technologies that can be used.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same for us. I think one thing that we continuously improve on from when we first started doing this type of work to now is, just kind of trying to put ourselves in the best position for success. And, for us, that's getting gear out of the water, right? Like that's essentially what the Ghost Gear Fund is for. And that's what the funding that we are given is really to be used for. So we try and, align all these factors we've been discussing and the technologies that we have into what, we hope to be the most successful approach for a particular area, be it, targeting superficial geology that we know will have a lot of success in, right? I mean, sometimes it's cherry picking because, I mean, sadly, there's so much gear out there that, why would we go spend weeks looking in the rocks and get a lot less gear out of the water when we could spend those weeks looking out on the flat in the muddy bottom? We're going to have a lot higher, frequency of success. So, and same goes for the equipment. I mean, multi-beam side scan or ROV, we've tried them all, and we've had success with all of them to some degree, but when it boils right down to it, side scan really is our bread and butter. I mean, that's what we use on every job. And, we may add different technologies to help support that in certain spots, but, I think that's really a lot of just trial and error and, having success here or not there and just trying to refine your approach for each spot that you're working.
Great, thanks. I see another question from Pina in the chat. Talking about passive sonar reflectors, something you had mentioned, Kyle, and Colin, that came out of our I think it was initially mentioned in one of the workshops that we were in Halifax that the GGGI put on last year, where some of the fishers had said, well, can we just put sonar reflectors on some of the gear just so that you can passively identify it a little easier? I didn't realize that this is being trialed in Europe, Pina, to make gillnecks more acoustically detectable to harbor porpoises and avoid bycatch. But it does work to make them more visible. I don't know about these polymer pearls. When you say polymer, I imagine that's plastic. So I imagine that would be more plastic that's entering the ocean in another form as well. I honestly don't know what the acoustic reflectors would be made of. And Colin, Joan, maybe you guys would have more of a sense of what that might look like. But Pina, if you wanted to jump in as well and maybe give a little bit more context, that would be great.
I don't really have more context than that. It was shown at a cetacean whale and dolphin conference in April in Sicily, and I wasn't there. I only heard about it because everybody was like telling me about it, going, there are those pearls on the nets, they're amazing, they make them more visible. And I thought, yeah, but there are also more plastic bits on the nets, and at the moment these pearls are put on by hand, so they clip onto the net. They are, I don't know, maybe a centimeter in diameter, and they clip around the gill net in various locations. So you'll have, I don't know, on 100-meter net you'll have probably 1,000 of those pearls, if not more. And I don't know how good the clipping system is, so they could fall off. So potentially introducing more litter into the marine environment. But what they showed on the acoustics is that the net is more visible. So essentially that would be good for bycatch or against bycatch. But I just thought maybe they could also be used for the side scan sonar. But I don't know. It's a very new thing, I think.
Joan or Colin, any thoughts on that? I mean, obviously,
Well, I
we
think when
you
we're,
gave
I
your info,
think,
but
and Colin, maybe you would, jump in, but when I think what we're talking about in terms of having something a little bit more reflective would probably be something that might be metal that you'd put in the pod, or that would be more reflective. Just having more plastic might not be what we're after. And I guess I would say, I don't know anything about that the gill net pearls. Obviously, anything that makes a gill net more visible is could potentially affect the catch efficiency of the net. So I don't have really anything to say about that because I don't know very much about it.
I mean, for us, it really popped onto our radar in the workshop that we did in Halifax. And as you know, Joel, we've done some work for you looking for gill nets. And I mean, they're not the easiest thing to find with side scan. I mean, I'd like to talk to Joan a bit on how she's managed to find 5,800 of them. I mean, the reality is there's a lot of them out there, obviously, but you know, the idea just from our perspective seemed like a no-brainer because you know, these things obviously, you know, they go in the water. We all know they're going to get lost just to a certain degree. And obviously we want to get these gill nets out of the water. They're one of the biggest, you know, killers of lost gear, right? And you know, to put a sonar reflector on it, like a, you know, would need to be regulated, you know, through DFO, say, hey, look, all gill nets made after this date need to have whatever, you know, how many sonar reflectors, you know, something that can just be put on these nets that, because we already know that side scan is, you know, the most likely method of finding these in a lot of spots. So why not make the, you know, the percentage of finds higher, right? Just from having some sort of reflector on there that, because I mean, you saw those images of the seine nets and gill nets. I mean, you know, they're just little tiny strips of rope, you know, in the data, but if it had a reflection on it, we'd know right away, boom, there's a gill net. So
yeah, and I think correct me if I'm wrong, but it was interesting to me that that was raised by the fishers in that workshop. That wasn't something that came from DFO or from us. That was the fishers said, well, can we just do this? Would that make life easier? Which I thought was interesting coming from them. They said, well, they're cheap. Like it would not be difficult to put those on there. And I think, and Colin, Joan, question for you is,
were they referring to nets, Joel, or pots?
Either or. Either or. So I think, like, I don't know how big a metal reflector would need to be in order to send a clear enough signal back. But if you had those even every, like, as Pina, I'm talking about quite a lot of those different things along the nets, you might not need that many. If you had them every so often, 10 meters or 15 meters or something like that, but it was a clear enough signal. When you see that rope line on the end, you're going to see a bunch of those dots. You're going to kind of know. Is that a fair enough thing to say, Joan and Colin? You guys are the experts, but that's what it sounds like to me.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, that's generally what you're looking for. You're looking for the rope. It's really difficult to find the mesh unless it's all balled up or in a pretty high dense, you know, pile. Generally what we'll see is just what Colin said, is you'll see that anomaly, you'll see the lead line in some way on the surface of the seafloor that just doesn't look right, and that's where you zone in.
Yeah, and it seems like, I mean, I don't know what a sonar reflector costs, honestly, but I can't imagine it's a huge cost. And you know, for something that's generally cheap to be implemented and regulated, that would obviously drive our, you know, the likelihood of us getting these nets and pots. I mean, pots, traps, they could all have a reflector on them, and it would certainly make life easier when you're going to look for these things.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that was raised by the fishing community as well at that workshop was that not only would it be easier for folks like NRC and CSR to locate and recover that gear after the fact, but they'd see gear that's deployed pretty easily with their own sonars just on their vessels. And it might not be to the resolution of side scan, but they'd be able to say, there's something there. I don't want to deploy my gear on top of that big pile of whatever's already there, which could decrease the frequency of gear loss due to gear and conflict and entanglement that way with other deployed gear. I'm aware that we are at and actually slightly over time. Colin and Joan, are you guys okay to go for a few more minutes? I know you guys have very busy schedules, and I'll leave that entirely up to you.
Well, sure. I'd love to answer the last question in there and then probably
Okay, perfect. All right, for those of you maybe on mobile and can't see the question, I'll read it out. This is from William again. Curiously, what is the cost of using sonar technology, especially for least developed countries, and if it is the best technique for the detection of ghost gear? So, Joan, yeah.
Well, the cost will vary depending on how you're using it and who's running it. But I guess I think it probably is safe to say that it is one of the more expensive ways to locate gear, but it can also be very cost effective because you can cover just a lot of ground with it. Some of the countries that I've worked in, they just don't have the technology even available. Anywhere that you're working that has in some of the less developed countries, say in Africa, so like Kenya, I mean, they're going to have some sonar technology, a big country like that with a lot of fisheries and a lot of mapping and mineral deposits. So anywhere where you're going to have technology and industry that is doing any kind of mapping it's probably side scan sonar. And so you can find a technician there that can do it. Now getting them to really understand how to find ghost gear there's a little bit of technique in it. Obviously, it's a craft and it's an art, and the more experienced you are, the better you are at it. So it's not something that you can just slap on a boat and go out and do it and be successful. So I guess that's a long answer to your question, and the costs vary depending, we can do a day of side scan sonar here in the Salish Sea for about maybe $3,000 US, but it may be more or less in different places, depending on the size of your vessel too.
Yeah, the vessel is a big one. I mean, that's more of the cost than the side scan, right, at the end of the day. So but there's also different degrees of side scan, like we have a helix. I mean, we've literally have a fish finder helix, they've got helix 7, 8, 9, 10. I mean, these are like just commercial fish finders that nowadays the technology is to a point where you can get some pretty amazing things at Bass Pro Shop. And we have used that, which is, I mean, you could walk out of Bass Pro Shop with $1,000 side scan and you can go out there and use it. There's some disadvantages going, something that costs $1,000, most of the time it's vessel mounted. You're not able to put it on a big winch and drop it down deep, get it close to the bottom a lot of times. But I mean, something like that works in shallow water, right? And we've used it successfully. So other side scans, like what we typically use, our Klein 3000, I mean, that's, a system like that is going to cost you, 50, 60, 70. I mean, some of the new side scans, if you were to go buy one off the market right now, would be over $100,000. Some of the, professional grade ones. So, I mean, there is quite a range. The data quality that comes out of them, usually the more you pay, the better the data quality, the more ability that machine has, like longer, wider ranges, right? So, an expensive side scan, you could see 250, 300, 400 meters off each side. So you're covering a huge swath at the bottom, as opposed to a smaller transducer, which may get you 25 meters off each side, right? So, yeah, it's quite a range, really. But the boat is usually the biggest cost of any of these jobs.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for your time, Joan and Colin. I think despite the fact we were one panelist short, we still had a really good conversation. And thank you so much to everyone for the questions in the chat. Really do appreciate that. And thank you again all for your time to be here, to answer questions, and to have this conversation. And yeah, hopefully this has answered some questions that people have had and been enlightening. And yeah, we look forward to the next one. Thanks so much, everyone. We will talk to you soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Joel.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you.